My name is Theodora Lacey, and I have something to say. Well, perhaps it had something to do with my growing up in a segregated system in Alabama and with parents who were strong advocates for education and succeeding in life. And so they taught me as a youngster that no matter the obstacles, that you try and do your very best and not give up. And so from a young child, even though there were many things that stood in the way of my achieving simple goals, I was always taught to get up and try again and to keep trying, and that one day things would change. Growing up in the segregated South was like a quilt. It was so confusing sometimes. Different patches, different places that you could and could not go. As a youngster, I was not allowed to go into certain shops to try on clothes or shoes. I recall my mother used to take the shape of my foot on a cardboard and go and shop for the shoes because I was not allowed in the store or would have to sit in the back of the store on a cart, a wooden cart, rather than sitting in the seats. That I could not go to the theaters or to the museum. In Montgomery, there was a famous zoo called the Oak Park Zoo. And as a child, I was not able to attend that zoo. Schools were segregated. Everything was segregated. Could not go into the public parks to play. And so you were reminded constantly that there was an attempt to make you feel inferior. And it left a scar on you that you had to overcome and to work hard to prove that you were worthy as any other citizen. Yes, I was very fortunate to grow up with two well-educated parents. My father was principal of, at a period of time, the only school for Blacks and high school for Blacks in the town. And my mother taught third grade for over 40 years. She and Rosa Parks grew up as children and maintained their friendship throughout their life. I had the opportunity to bring Mrs. Parks from to Teaneck, New Jersey, which was quite a highlight for my students and my children. So we grew up in a rather, I guess, middle class environment, but everything was segregated. We were limited in terms of what we could do outside the Black community. As long as you were in the Black community, there was lots of support and love and care. But the minute you had to go outside the Black community, you faced the obstacles of that segregation imposed on you. As I said earlier, you could not shop in certain shops. Montgomery was the capital of the state. You could not go into the Capitol building or in the state building. You could not attend schools except for schools that were regulated for African Americans. And you could tell those schools because they were the ones that were least cared for. If you walked inside the building, you would see furniture that had been discarded from the white schools and brought to the African American school. More than that, the books and materials were books that had been used and discarded from the white schools and brought to the African American schools. Every attempt was made to make you feel that you were less than. But my parents taught me that if you get an education, no one can take that from you. And that one day, as I said earlier, one day things would change. I often think of the Montgomery bus boycott as really being a miracle. In Montgomery, if you rode the bus, you would have to sit in the back of the bus, and there was a sign that said color, and you could not sit in front of it. You had to sit behind the sign that said color. If the bus filled with more white passengers, then the bus driver would move the sign and keep moving it until there was hardly any place to sit on the bus. Many people would have to get off the bus. I have witnessed times when you were asked to put your money into the token slot in the front of the bus and then go to the rear of the bus to get on. Often the bus driver would leave before you could get to the rear. And sometimes I've seen incidents where elderly people were caught, their sleeves caught in the bus, and we had to scream to the bus driver to stop, to keep from dragging people. It was just not the inability to sit in a seat on the bus, but it was the cruel and unjust treatment that caused this devastating experience to happen. I had a very close friend who became my daughter's godmother, who had written, she was very active in the town, and she had written to the city officials to designate a permanent place where Blacks could sit, that they didn't have to get up and move if more white passengers got on. They totally ignored her. And so there was always concern and an effort to do something about the segregation on the buses, and as I say, the cruel treatment. And so many attempts were made to try to stop it. Many people were arrested. Many people were held at gunpoint to get off the bus. It was just very cruel. It just so happened that Rosa Parks decided to not move from the colored section where she was sitting to give up her seat for a white passenger. That really ignited the bus boycott. And because people knew Rosa Parks as an outstanding citizen in the community, it really kind of helps the people to finally come together and say no more of this. And my friend that I spoke of earlier, Joanne Robinson, spoke to members of the clergy and the NAACP and said, it is time then now we should boycott the buses. A meeting was held soon after that with the clergy and some other community leaders, and they selected Dr. King as the one who would be the spokesperson. Dr. King was the youngest among the group, had been in Montgomery less than 2 years, but had become well known because of his ability to speak so well, and he did so to so many groups. So he was chosen to be the leader, and that was the beginning of the boycott. I can remember the morning, the first day of the boycott, when we all awakened to see if people would stay off the buses. It was truly a miracle to see that no African Americans were on the bus. I have to tell my young friends that the use of the bus was essential because most families did not own cars. And so in Montgomery, if you were not a professional like a teacher or a nurse or a social worker in the Black community, you did domestic work. Most of the population did domestic work, and long work, and therefore they needed to ride the bus. But when they stayed off the bus that morning, we were excited and eager to get started. It was not easy because the domestic workers that they should be given so much credit for the success of the boycott needed to get to work. So we organized carpools and efforts to get people back and forth to work. I played a role as a typist, typing news releases for the paper, typing letters to be sent out all over the country, asking for funds to keep the boycott going, and also in taking people back and forth to work. So I was sometimes, I guess, known as a gopher because I was young at the time. Absolutely. He was a professor at the local Alabama State College. And so we met going to the boycott meetings, which were held all during the week, and especially on the weekend. And my kids teased me about the fact that our courtship was one of attending meetings trying to get the boycott going. And he often would reply, yes, I married her out of protest. I think he really meant that he married me right after the protest ended. Actually, we moved to New York City. My husband was given an appointment as a professor at Hunter College in New York. But because I was not accustomed to living in apartments and having to take the elevator down to take the children out to the park and etc., I urged my husband to find us a home. And we were fortunate to have friends that lived in Teaneck. We visited Teaneck and fell in love with this quaint town. And we soon learned about its educational excellent school system. And so we moved to Teaneck. We knew, of course, that there was discrimination in the North as well as the South, but that it was not as harsh and as blatant. There were no signs, even though we knew that segregation occurred and that often in the North you were denied opportunities because you were Black, but it wasn't as open and blatant as in the South. When we moved to Teaneck, our neighborhood, the Northeast neighborhood, was quite an integrated environment. But soon after, as more African Americans began to move to Teaneck, they were only shown houses in the Northeast, not in any other parts of the city. And so soon, the Northeast became heavily populated with African Americans. We were very pleased that in Teaneck we had neighborhood schools so the kids in the neighborhood could walk to their schools. But we knew well from our research and just learning about schools, especially in the North, that when they become 50% or more African American, something happens to the schools. Teachers leave, funds seem to dwindle, the curriculum changes. It was just not good. And so, as we saw the increase of African Americans in our neighborhood school, we thought that we needed to do something about it because the rest of the town did not have any African American students. And so we met with the superintendent who was new to the area, but very attentive to concerns about the the becoming of a segregated neighborhood school, welcomed us. And so we worked and with the Board of Education. It took a while to even convince our African American neighbors that we needed to do something because we were all quite pleased with the 30% African American population in the neighborhood school, but we saw it increasing. Now, we were not afraid or concerned about it just being a school populated with African Americans because we knew well that you can learn in such an environment how to read and write. After all, my husband and I did. He went on to get a PhD degree. And so, but what we did not get was an understanding and appreciation of us. And we wanted our children to grow up in an environment where they could learn and be a part and learn about all of the many things that we had that are alike, and also appreciate what is different among different groups. And so we worked hard. We spent our weekend visiting with neighbors in the Northeast community, and we were able to help to support the first year, which was called a volunteer desegregation plan. It did not work because no whites volunteered to come into the African American neighborhood. And the second year of this plan, 13 African American students went out to neighborhood schools all over TNA, but only one white family came into the Northeast. And so we knew then that that would not work. And we kept pushing for a more equitable plan. And that's when the superintendent and the board of education came up with the centralized sixth grade plan, which was a model and worked extremely well. If you speak with students who attended that school, they would concur that it was one of the best experiences that they have had. Students in the Northeast were bussed all over the town, making other schools more equitable. And whites from the other side of town came into the Northeast to the Central Sixth Grade School. We just celebrated our 60th year of desegregation in Teaneck without violence or without a court mandate. Sure, I guess because we have been activists all our lives, we immediately became involved in Teaneck when we arrived in Teaneck. And Fair Housing was one of the groups that we participated in very early. We would serve as testers, and we were paired with a white couple, and we would go out to try to test buying houses and apartments, and we would be denied an opportunity to purchase a house. So that it was not, it was sold, it was, and some excuses as to why we did not measure up. Our white counterpart would go after us, and they would often be accepted and given the opportunity to buy the house. This kind of information was documented and played a major role in the housing ruling that changed discrimination in purchasing houses and in renting apartments. I am chair of the Martin Luther King Birthday Committee, and each year we hold an annual event that honors people, young and old, who are actively trying to make change in the community. I'm also on the board of the Teaneck Film Festival that brings films to the community that speak about change and the importance of change of all people, of all ethnic and religious, racial groups. Uh, I serve on the board of the uh, historical preservation and trying to record outstanding citizens who have lived in our community, many of whom are Black. And so I'm still quite active. I do a lot of lecturing in schools. I organized what was called Teens Talk About Racism, where each year we would bring high school students in and have a day-long conference on issues about discrimination, which helped them to go back to their schools and try to implement plans to keep those kinds of uh, segregated thoughts and behaviors from occurring in that school. So I'm quite active still at 92. As a teacher, I guess it would have to be the integration of schools and teenage, even though the population does not look as it did in the 70s and 80s, because many, especially whites, have move their children to private schools or elsewhere. To me, that was probably the most impactful activity that I was involved in, because it reached young people. And I think that we have to begin with young people, those in helping to shape their thoughts and their minds about how the importance of living together and appreciating one another. And I think education probably is the tool to do that. And it should start at home, and if not at home, in our early childhood education, letting children get to know one another and having them to not develop these prejudices that started at a very young age. I remember being involved in a research with a woman in teenage who was doing her doctorate, and she patterned after a project that was done at City University in trying to determine when do prejudices really begin. And so she did a study with Black and white dolls. And it was so interesting that at that early age with preschool children, that they had formulated some prejudices about things that were people, I should say, dolls that were of color were not as good as the dolls that were white. So I think my work in education would probably be the most important thing in my life that I have been able to be involved in. I am extremely proud of the young people today. Uh, my only concern is that somehow they're able to learn their history, because if you do not know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And while it may not look the same, the intent is the same in terms of making people feel inferior, lessening the opportunities for people based on reasons that are unfair and unjust. So I am proud that many young people are willing to stand up and speak out. I just hope that they can gird themselves with as much history as possible, so that when things occur, they can immediately see it or sense it and be able to learn from the past history how they must approach and what they must do to change things or to prevent these awful atrocities from happening, regardless of one's religion or gender or race. I'd share with you that a few days ago, Valley Dickinson University awarded me a Doctor of Humane Letters. And I said to them, even at 92, one can learn. And that I accepted that honor because it indicated to me that when you learn more, you must do more. So I must continue as long as I can to try to do whatever I can to help us to learn to live in a more humane and loving manner.